Oh, here we go. All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Christine Hull, and I will be facilitating Unit 1 for We the People National Finals Top 12. This is very exciting. We have Massachusetts with us here today. In a moment, I will have the judges introduce themselves, followed by the students, and then we will begin the hearing. Students will deliver a 4-minute prepared statement, followed by 10 minutes of judges' questions, which is still not enough time. My microphone will be muted during the hearing, and I will hold up 1 minute and time signs. I got them right this time. And I suggest you use gallery view versus speaker view. Our students have been spotlighted so that they stay on the top. And at the conclusion of the hearing, the judges will give brief feedback to the teams, and then we will conclude. So judges, the floor is yours.
And awesome. We are delighted to be with you from Easthampton. What part of Massachusetts is Easthampton in?
It's in Western Massachusetts.
Where?
It's in Western Massachusetts.
Western Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I spent several summers way before you were born working in Cape Cod, so that would be the other Massachusetts.
Yeah.
The other Massachusetts.
I know they are different worlds, even though they seem close together to the rest of us. My name is Tandy McConnell. I was a professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina for about 20 years. I decided to do something different. So right now I am teaching high school social studies and having a great time doing that. I am honored to be here with you. I'll ask my colleagues if they will introduce themselves.
Go ahead, Margo.
Hi, I am Margo Lambert, professor of history at the University of Cincinnati, Blue Ash College. My grandmother, who was a native Bostonian, called me Mago. So nice to meet you.
I'm Sue Leeson, a senior justice on the Oregon Supreme Court.
And would you introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon. I'm Jack Belcher-Timmy, and we're representing Easthampton, Massachusetts.
Good afternoon. I'm Emma Ginter, and we're all juniors at Easthampton High School.
Good afternoon. I'm Gabe Raposa, and start teacher in Skyler Brown.
Good afternoon.
And good afternoon. Are you guys in Massachusetts now, or are you in Washington?
We're in DC.
Awesome. So I hope you've had a chance to do some fun things while you were there.
Yeah, it's been great.
Oh, good. Well, you got about another hour to go, and then we will let you go, and you get to do some more fun stuff. What are your plans for the afternoon?
Stop it. That's the question.
Never mind, maybe don't. But we are your Unit 1 judges. They're telling me to get down to work, the business here. We're interested in the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system. We're asking question 2 today. The foundation for good government is the rule of law. John Adams once wrote, "Good government is an empire of laws." How, if at all, is the rule of law embedded in our founding documents? What challenges to the rule of law, if any, have we experienced in our history? In what ways, if any, has the rule of law been important to the preservation of a free society? If you're ready, please begin.
Rule of law, at its core, is security from violence and the fear that violence breeds. British rule of law began in the medieval period as the King's Peace and developed into a complex legal system that not only provided security from violence, but limited government officials to protect liberty. In 1764, James Otis spoke of higher law and fundamental rights in his pamphlets opposing the use of writs of assistance in Massachusetts. He argued it is contrary to reason that Parliament should have the right to alter the Constitution. That would imply they have the right to do as they please. The problem was that Parliament did have the power to alter the Constitution.
Following Otis, John Dickinson wrote a series of essays called Letters from a Farmer in response to the Townshend Act and the suspension of the New York legislature. He argued Parliament's powers should be limited to navigation acts and that direct taxation should be left to colonial assemblies. After the coercive acts, Jefferson wrote his summary view of the rights of British America. Using Calvin's case, he argued that only the king deserved the allegiance of the colonies, that he had a responsibility to uphold the rule of law, stating kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. These principles, including fundamental rights, consent and limits on government officials, became the foundation of the constitutional documents that would follow.
In the Declaration of Independence, the colonists argued that the king had violated their fundamental rights according to the principles of higher law. It was not the law itself that was wrong, but the king and his ministers. In the Constitution, Article 1, Sections 8, 9, and 10 limits the government's power. Article 3 creates a Supreme Court and a federal court system with trial by jury in criminal cases. Higher law is established in the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, Clause 2, and an amendment for amending is provided in Article 5. By combining ancient ideas, British constitutionalism, and the Enlightenment, Americans established the concept of fundamental rights and a fixed constitution as higher law.
Throughout U.S. history, there have been many impactful challenges to the rule of law in terms of both security and limits on government. For example, in 1786, indebted farmers in Massachusetts rebelled against Governor James Bowdoin's austerity measures that threatened their livelihood. Led by Daniel Shays, thousands peacefully shut down courthouses across Hampshire County in defiance of the law, which they saw as a violation of their own liberties. Governor Bowdoin was forced to hire a private militia to suppress it. The Shayites argued that their rebellion was based on their government abusing power.
Other examples of disturbances of peace include rebellions of enslaved people, women's suffrage protests during World War I, and the disability rights movement. In more recent times, we can see a breakdown of rule of law in the January 6th insurrection, which was driven by the idea that Congress was certifying a corrupt election. While claiming to uphold the rule of law, January 6th was actually an attack on the rule of law. Starting with the addition of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution and judicial system has reined in the government to protect liberty as seen in Mappy, Ohio. The breakdown of rule of law and reestablishment of peace during the Civil War led to the 14th Amendment, which would become the most important guarantee of fundamental rights in America.
The rule of law is essential to a free society, but just simply having laws does not ensure freedom. According to Alfred Knight, in his book Life of the Law, once freedom from violence was ensured, the elite felt safe enough to create laws to rein in government officials, establishing liberty and protection from arbitrary government. Madison pointed out in Federalist 51 that in framing a government, they need to give the government enough control to keep peace, but not abuse its power. The founders were skeptical of human nature and understood that institutional boundaries were necessary to protect fundamental liberties. A culture of rule of law must exist where the people value liberty and are willing to hold government officials accountable, do not get impatient and wish for a king. Because without a culture of rule of law, government abuses become easier and the liberties become mere parchment protections. Thank you and ready for your questions.
Thank you very much. Long ago, and I'm not recommending this is a good idea, when I would be driving to work early in the morning, like at 4:45 and stuff like, there was nobody on the road and nobody was around. And there was this traffic light that was totally in my way. And I would occasionally sneak up on it and ignore it. And I harmed nobody. Obviously I was breaking the law, but was I also threatening the rule of law?
Well, I think that it's sort of an interesting gray area as far as sort of where that falls as far as just following sort of common sense and where that falls into trusting the government, trusting the laws put in place, and sort of a general idea of what is safe and what isn't. And I think that the goals of laws and the rule of law is to provide a sense of trust, a sense of security. And I think that it sort of is, it incorporates this idea that there are situations where it may not necessarily apply, but it should absolutely be something to sort of fall back on, something to rely on.
There really is a distinct line on what constitutes a breaking of rule of law. For example, maybe running through a streetlight is not breaking rule of law. Something more like civil disobedience is. Something that directly challenges the rule of law, something that will go to the government and say something is wrong with it.
Emma, are you arguing that civil disobedience is an attack on the rule of law, or did I misunderstand that?
I think that it serves as a way to sort of create change to the rule of law. And I think that in its own way, it is an attack on the rule of law. And I think it's a very successful and a smart way to attack the rule of law, because it's hard to blame somebody for sort of doing something wrong, for being violent when they're not actually doing anything wrong. They're not actually being violent. And it makes it a lot easier to sort of sway those against you, sway those that are neutral. I think that, well, it's not an attack on rule of law in a way that like is particularly violent or aggressive. It also leads to more success. I think this is exemplified by the civil rights movement in the United States, resulting in the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act as a result of bus boycotts, as a result of sit-ins, as a result of using children to participate. All of these sort of created this idea of civil disobedience to create positive change.
And you also see through Martin Luther King's idea of agape, where if you love the other side of your argument, like you yourself, it would bring them to have more compassion for you and bring them to your side of the argument. And so he preached that because he learned it from Gandhi in India. And so when he used civil disobedience in America, it brought more people to his side of the issue and made the civil rights movement much more successful.
Very good. What about, you mentioned the women's suffrage movement, which was derailed by the Civil War and then almost derailed by World War I. So were they breaking the rule of law? I mean, how were they in the status when it came to the rule of law? Because we were at war. They were protesting, picketing a wartime president. Where do we draw the line to this kind of civil disobedience you talk about and taking care of the nation in a time of emergency?
Well, I think that obviously Civil War, World War I are very unique situations. I think that at the end of the day, the right for women to vote is something that was always, at least now that they do have the right to vote, it's not a problem anymore. But it was always something that warranted sort of a challenge, always warranted something to be sort of achieved. And I think that no specific frame of time really derailed that from happening, from them protesting at the very least. And I think that is sort of a key to it, is that voting is such a crucial part of the rule of law because it involves yourself. And when half of the population can't vote, it's hard to say that you're doing anything wrong by disobeying the law civilly, no matter the circumstance.
You can also see part of the rule of law is that it's equally applied to everyone. And so even though voting is a fundamental right, before the women's suffrage movement, women didn't have the right to vote. So technically the rule of law was broken at that point. So by them practicing civil disobedience and fighting for their right to suffrage, they were kind of almost correcting the rule of law and getting the rights back.
Well, would you make the same argument with respect to the age restrictions on voting rights? The rights of 18-year-olds were violated until 1971?
I certainly think that that's a debate, but I think that it's entirely different from suppressing the rights of women to vote. I think that it's much more equal and it's much more logical. Whether 18 was an appropriate age, whether it should be younger, whether it should be older, is I think a little more debatable, a little bit more of an arbitrary line. But I think that because it's not exactly sort of attacking a minority in an illogical way, the way that the sort of voting rights would, I think that makes it a different experience.
So I'd like to take another example, and you threw out Shays' Rebellion in 1786. We had another rebellion on January 6th of last year. How are those two rebellions same or different, or what separates them in point of principle? Do you think one was more justified than the other? Using the framework of rule of law.
I think that as far as Shays' Rebellion, it was a challenge to the rule of law in that they believed that their state was putting unjust laws against them. And I think that I think as far as a similarity, they both believed that they were incredibly justified in what they were doing. I think that by at least beginning the rebellion peacefully in Shays' Rebellion and not sort of involving the Springfield Armory until Governor Bowdoin hired his private militia, I think that is a key difference between the two in sort of the way that they intended at least to go about it.
You can see
Go ahead.
The other differences that were in January 6th, they didn't really have a reason to rebel. They weren't wanting institutional change. They were just fueled by misinformation that this election was stolen. In Shays' Rebellion, the government was actually oppressing them with unfair taxes, and they did it peacefully. They peacefully shut down courthouses in Hampshire County, and that turned violent only because the governor tried to suppress it.
Well, and I was hoping you'd even keep going with that. They were fighting for a fundamental right of property, which was deprived of them after their incredible service in the Revolutionary War, and the government refused to pay them. That they didn't do anything wrong in some sense. They fought for the country and then they lost their property. That, it seems to me, is from the perspective that you've defined rule of law as having some element of protecting of rights that goes beyond the right to disagree with a government decision, makes it a fundamental difference. You quoted Federalist 51 as well. In that paper, Madison says the first job of government is to control the governed and then to control itself. So does that mean that rule of law is in tension with what the governed may want as the demos, the citizens, the sovereign people in the country? Is rule of law at odds with the concept of popular sovereignty?
I think that it still derives from the people, and I think that it is it doesn't necessarily always come in the most necessarily democratic Republican form. I think that there's a level of almost elitism, a level of sort of establishing this like higher bar involved in it. But I also think that at the same time, it still comes from the people. It's still elected government officials that came from the people, at least in the United States. And I think that by setting up that system, by governing the people themselves first, which is something that I think we take for granted, something in the United States that's not necessarily a concern on a day-to-day basis, at least for us. I think that then by governing themselves, it's sort of, it's the challenge. It's the one that we debate today.
You can go all the way back to Alfred the Great when he established the King's Peace. And so when that happened, people started to prefer a predictability under the law. Even though the government at that time had power of the people, most of the people agreed with it because it was derived from religion. But as you can see through history, yes, at times people have disagreed with how their government is treating them. And that's why the other prime rule of law, which is the government wanting to protect themselves from the people, they created change, like the Petition of Right and British Bill of Rights, and the American Revolution, which was a revolution against Britain abusing the colonists.
Let's see, well, how are we on time? In the beginning of the revolution, I'm sorry.
Oh, you go ahead. Go ahead.
At the beginning of the revolution, actually before the revolution, Benjamin Franklin was trying to persuade Parliament that the only thing the Americans really want is representation in Parliament. Had Parliament allowed 13 American representatives in Parliament, would that have changed the dynamic? Would the Americans therefore have no longer been able to argue that they were fighting for freedom? Because of course they would be participating in the making of their own laws. What is your thought on that particularly bizarre question?
I think that it probably would have changed the dynamic, but I certainly don't think that it's what it would have satisfied them in any way. What the colonists truly wanted in America was representation, especially regarding taxes, through their general assemblies. They wanted representation coming from them in their location. They didn't want a distant parliament ruling them, even with people involved. They didn't, even though it wouldn't be virtual representation, I think it would still feel remote. It would still feel distant. I think that was the key. In John Dickinson's pamphlets, Letters from a Farmer, he argued that it's not the tax themselves, it's the precedent that's fatal. That's what concerns them, and that's what they feared, and that's what a distant parliament could enforce in their eyes.
Outstanding. The timing was perfect.
So shall I go ahead?
Go ahead.
I just want to say extremely well done, especially as someone who originally started out studying the founding era and then transitioned to early American history. I loved your deep understanding of what was happening in the Revolutionary period into the founding era. The mention of James Otis, severely underrated. I would recommend the book by Akil Reed Amar, The Words That Made Us. I'm reading it right now, and I think it would be an excellent sidebar to what you've been studying here and arguing here in your congressional hearing. I just thought you guys did a remarkable job. I really understanding again the history. I like the comparison of Shays' Rebellion to the Sixth, and I thought the bizarre question was a wonderful question and one that was very important. And you guys, I think as a historian, I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb here and say you guys were right. Having 13 representatives in Parliament wouldn't have worked. There's no email back then, right? There's 6 months if you're lucky on the ship, right? A letter, okay, if you're lucky. And yeah, that would not have. I think you're absolutely right. I think most historians would concur. Nicely done.
Yeah. You talk about a gray area when I was running red lights and stuff like that. I think that's, that in reality, that's absolutely right. We quite often the rule of law and the demands of democracy and the demands of the people and a need of good government takes us one thing, and obedience to the rule of law takes us someplace else. With my case, I was breaking the law. I deserved to go. I thought of that one time I was being driven in Eastern Europe, and the taxi driver got tired of waiting for a stoplight, so he got all four wheels on the sidewalk and going backwards at a high speed. It may give me a great deal of respect for that unspoken regard for even basic, driving skills. I thought, so yes, we find ourselves trying to negotiate our way between what it may be right and necessary, between what may be right and what may be necessary. Enjoyed your conversation, and I was glad to hear from Letters from a Farmer, glad to hear from Otis, glad to hear your discussion on federal, mentioning Federalist 51 and a culture of the rule of law. It's a great discussion. Thank you so much.
I agree. That was a very, very enlightening conversation. You started out by defining the rule of law as having a purpose, security from violence, but being limited to protecting liberty. If that's how you understood the rule of law, then Tandy going through a stoplight is hardly in the same category. The rule of law is a principle. It's aimed at achieving some higher principle goal, and in fact is at odds potentially with some other principles in American politics. I really liked the way you started with that definition. I wish you had stayed with it a little bit more. There's evidence that we as a people are willing to give up our liberty when we fear. And fear of violence is one thing we really, we're willing to consent to being searched at airports without probable cause because we fear the violence of a plane flying into a bunch of towers in New York. The Patriot Act, we gave up an immense amount of liberty, sacrificed an immense amount of liberty in the name of preventing violence. Americans overwhelmingly supported Japanese internment, even though that was a breach of every fundamental concept because we were in fear at the time. And so what I was hoping that you would do more, and I think would even strengthen a fabulous presentation, is to work with that relationship, since you set it up, or you set it out there for us to think about. I think it's a great way to think about the rule of law, and I would love it if you had been willing to stay with it a little more. I don't think that definition provides the ground to say that the right to vote of women was always there. It's almost in the content of a natural law that was being violated until the 19th Amendment. I just think we're mixing apples and oranges there. But certainly the society does evolve in terms of our understanding of who does belong in that category that you laid out about the function of the rule of law. I love the way you responded to our questions. I love the fact that you brought in so much rich history, and I agree with you completely that having 13 representatives in Parliament would not have stopped the revolution. As one scholar says, that revolution occurred in fact well before it occurred in law, and we were there. So thanks, guys. That was a great job.